Okay, now let's talk about sizing elements. So I'm going to define a div with a class of box. Now, let's define a rule for our box and give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of gold. So here's what we get. Now, if you hover our mouse over this element in the DOM, right here, we can see the actual size of this element. So 100 by 100 pixels, right? Now, this is where a lot of people new to CSS get confused. If you apply a padding or a border, our box is going to get bigger. Let me show you. So let's set a padding of 20 pixels and a border of 10 pixel, solid orange. Look, our box got bigger because by default, the width and height properties are applied to the content box. So any padding or border that we apply will increase the size of the visible box. Now let's find out the actual size of this box. It is 160 by 160 pixels. Look at the legend. So we have a left border of 10 pixels, a left padding of 20 pixels. The content area is 100 pixels. Then we have a right padding of 20 pixels and a right border of 10 pixels. When we add all these numbers together, we'll come up with 160 pixels. So this is what you need to take away. By default, the width and height properties are applied to the content box. And any padding or border that we apply will increase the size of the visible box. But what about the margin property? The margin property does not impact the size of the visible box. It will just move this box away from other boxes. Let's find out. So I'm going to set the margin to 50 pixels. Look, our box moved away from its original position, but its size hasn't changed. It's still 160 by 160 pixels, okay? So let's get rid of the margin property. So as you can see, calculating the actual size of an element can get a little bit complex. We don't want to go through this hassle all the time. So this is where the box sizing property comes to the rescue. By default, this property is set to content box. That is why we have this weird behavior. But if you set this to border box, the size that we specify here will be applied to the border box. So look, our box is now 100 pixels by 100 pixels. Look at the legend. We have 10 pixels left border and 20 pixels padding left. These values are subtracted from the width of 100 pixels. That is why our content area is now reduced to 40 pixels. Now, if we remove the padding and border properties, our box is still 100 by 100 pixels. In this case, the content area is now 100 by 100 pixels. So by setting the box sizing property, calculating the size of an element becomes easier and more predictable. But there's a problem here. We don't want to apply this property to every single HTML element. What if you have another element with a class of product? We don't want to repeat this. This is where we can use the universal selector. So on the top, we can use the universal selector to select all HTML elements. I didn't cover this in the previous section because, quite frankly, there are not many use cases for the universal selector and you shouldn't use it that often because it can have performance implications. So most of the time, we use the universal selector to select all elements and set their box sizing property to border box. That is the most common scenario. Now, let's get rid of this property. So box sizing is applied on the top, and we'll still get the same result. There's just one problem. This rule does not apply to pseudo elements. Remember pseudo elements, like the before or after elements? If we insert a pseudo element in our DOM, this rule will not apply to that pseudo element. Let me show you. So I'm going to define a new rule, box before. So we're going to insert something before the content of our box. I'm going to say hello. Take a look. So here's our box. Let's expand it in the DOM. So here's our pseudo element before. Now this element is using the default box sizing, that is content box. Let me show you. So look at the computed tab. And here we have 4 properties: content, display, height, and width. There is no box sizing. But if we select another element, like our box, here we have the box sizing property. So to solve this problem, we need to extend this rule like this. So all elements before, all elements after. Now this property is applied to all elements as well as all the elements that are inserted before or after the content of these elements. So take a look. So let's select our pseudo element before, and under the computed tab, you can see box sizing is set to border box. So this is a more comprehensive way of setting the box sizing property. Now, one last thing before we finish this lesson. The width and height properties are only applied to block level elements. So earlier I told you that block level elements are inserted on a new line and they take up the entire available horizontal space. So look at our box. Even though it's 100 by 100 pixels, it's taking the entire available horizontal space. So if you add a second box, this new box is inserted on a new line, okay? So divs are block level elements. Now let's replace these divs with spans. So I'm going to select this div and hold down Command and D on Mac or Control and D on Windows to select the second div occurrence. Now we have two cursors, right? Let's press Command and D one more time. Now we have three cursors, and one more time, we have four cursors. Let's replace all these elements with a span. Save the changes. What's going on here? The reason this is happening is because inline elements don't respect the width and height properties. But what if you want to have an inline element and be able to give it a width and a height? This is where we use the display property. For span or inline elements in general, this property is set to inline by default. For divs, it's set to block. But we have a third value here called inline block. This is like the combination of inline and block level elements. Just like block level elements, we can give these elements a width and a height. And just like inline elements, these elements are not inserted on a new line. So we're going to have two boxes laid out horizontally next to each other, but these boxes will have a dimension. Take a look. So save. Here you go. Now, in case you're wondering why we have this space in between these two boxes, here's the reason. I'll put the cursor on the end of this line. Now I'm going to press the right arrow. See, we have a few spaces in between these elements. All these spaces are normalized into a single space, and that's the reason we have a bit of space in between these two boxes. If you want to get rid of these boxes, we have to put these spans next to each other. Now, they're completely attached to each other. So let's quickly recap. Using the width and height properties, we can set the size of our elements. But as you saw, by default, the size is applied to the content box, which can get a little bit complicated. So, using the box sizing property, we tell browsers that the size should be applied to the border box. Now, we don't want to add this declaration for every single HTML element. So this is where we use the universal selector to target all HTML elements. And finally, inline elements like span don't respect the width and height properties. To be able to give them a width and a height, we have to set their display to inline block.